Again in studio, this time about theory, but also about the practice and different forms of the protocols together with American, but also European, but also England standards. Of course, if world is Africa, we are in Africa again. Every time we meet and we think about the world, also think about the Africa. A lot of people think about fortune, improvement, better life, amazing shelters they could have, and they do not think about the Africa. But to think about Africa is also important, or what type of attribute there are. Of course, it's not easy to understand different forms of the model if you are going to make thousands of films in Africa. But of course, that's much different if you would make any movie in America or in Europe. Of course, software can also support making some movie, but also to design a better, simple forum with the graphics. Not easy to build different forms of the class in a code if you are building a better graphics. Graphics are actually different forms of the functions, and some even think that also function very well in different forms of the scripture for your bed. Women might like that, men might like that, but me actually dislike the idea that you could actually program people how to act in bed. Of course, for different people that are looking for more love or passion or more extreme forms of the animal conditions, that might be the right way of programming. But it's also philosophy what is right in programs if you are actually programmed bad. Not easy to think about different forms of the guide, also if you are programming, but also the computation together with the algorithm for the bed, if you are thinking about that. Now you see how extreme it could be in programming or different forms of the interface. To understand that, you also must provide safety together with the code, but also to understand simple C++ interface together with the different forms of the binary function compatible with different forms of the fashion. And of course, fashion, it's not simple. To understand studios around the world, imagine the Africa. How much studio is in Africa, especially for programming? To understand the B-Java forms, it's not easy, but also multi-paradigm together with that. Well, there are actually a lot of type of class, like A Java, A Java, B Java, and C Java. Also, D Java are not the same forms of the Java. Those are the four first Java that you can see, the A, B, C, and D. The A, B, C, D Java, it's not simple forms of the software, but of course, for commercial use, you might simply use low-level, simple forms of the Java. Of course, you are going to program with different forms of the couple, man or woman. Of course, you can also code that together with the animals, but it's not easy to understand that there are different forms of the programming language, and some developers are really able sometimes, and they are going to build a very, very difficult programs for people. So if you are in applications, also think about ethics. The ethics are also important if you are a programmer, but of course, when it comes to fortune, a lot of people forget that. There are millions of different forms of the ledgers, but those are just different forms of the circuits the programmers actually do not know because they are working for their company. Of course, there are different forms of the versions for programmers. And if you are a lady and you want to find a smart programmer, probably the programmer should actually prohibit you to code, but also prohibit you to be involved in his applications. Well, of course, if you are a lady, you can actually make deals with him. But of course, now you also see how applications are extremely difficult when it comes to status. The status is something programmers are aware of or they are not aware of, but it's actually very important to build English language if you want higher level of the design, also higher level of different forms of Java, also a better level of architecture, but also better level of the computer. Of course, the speech you see from me, it's actually not simple. It is not perfect. It is not the best. And of course, it's not the most famous, but it's still important to understand the simple legacy of simple casual designs and also to understand different forms of the bugs that you could actually find in programs. To understand those type of systems, it's not easy. But actually, it's also not easy to understand software. For most of people, it looks like life, but in that part, if you look from that point and from that case, then life is just a movie. To understand computer software, it's not simple. For most of people, they will not think about it they will think about computer or just how they see computer. They'll just think about, okay, software, that's nothing special. They'll just think about what's on their desktop. They'll just think about simple things and also feel it's not simple when it comes to software, if you could feel anything about it, of course. After 6 years of intense study, but of course, it's not easy to compare that with different forms of the software. Me also seen that it's not easy to build different forms of the circuits. Of course, the study and teaching have the valuation of the zero because there is actually some sort of philosophy it is a philosophy what's the best software, so there is some sort of war what is the best. But if you look from the point of what is simple, of course, that is totally something else. And you can also think about machine or ledgers from a different point of view, that they are just simple forms of the language. Of course, there might be five basic English language and also some language together with coding are actually slightly more healthy. That might be also the language related to Taoism. Not easy to understand users because those are actually most of the time very religious or very sporty or very thinking about their priority together with their partner. And if you are a coder, you should actually look on your partner as the user. So, what you are going to offer to that user. Of course, it might be more complex if you have more partners and if you are more beautiful, because those are usually extremely complex in philosophy. To understand different forms of models together with different forms of the machine in cars is also very difficult. But of course, that's very difficult to understand. If you are going to study all type of machine, then it's a mess and extreme chaos, maybe even destruction of what you are thinking. The computers are actually a million times more safe than any form of the car. So if you want more safety, probably you should work more with your computer. You do not need other computers. But of course, if you have fabrics, then you can make millions of computers. But also think about Intel. The Intel is actually some sort of simple, intelligent, structured forum to build different forms of the circuits. And on those circuits are different forms of the software, also different forms of the language for the ledgers. One of those language together with ledgers is also simple microends. To understand different forms of the code, it's not easy, but also to block the people if they are extremely violent. To understand different forms of agents together with different code, it's also not easy, but also to understand different forms of control together with Pythons, algol, but also to build different forms of the blocks together with the architecture or maybe fashion. But in architecture, actually, the programming only play the visual parts, and those have different forms of the meanings. To understand Simula, that's also a programming language, But it's not easy because it's some sort of simulation. To understand different forms of protocols, of course, it's not easy if you are thinking about computers. Different forms of the scientists might think about different forms of software, but of course, there is no value if you don't understand the simple Java basics. If you understand the basics, of course, it's very important to understand different forms of the algol or even C++. If you are a programmer and you also think about health, you should actually drink a lot of juice. If you are going to drink a lot of juice, probably 100% juice is the best. It's really hard to understand different forms of the juice without sugar. And that, of course, is science. To understand science better, it's not easy, but also it's not easy to understand different forms of known people. Of course, very difficult to understand different forms of the science, but also inputs and outputs together with the monitors, but also different forms of the devices. The hardware is also not simple and include different forms of very difficult computer graphics. Sometimes it's not easy to build better and better life, but also it's not easy to build a better computing with 0% sugar. That's extreme difficult. Most of apps are full of nonsense and full of very dirty code sometimes. So it's very important also if you lead a company to build slightly more difficult forums, but also challenging forum for the designers and different forms of performers in coding company. Of course, your coding company can also manufacture different forms of the chips. Processing banks, it's not easy because it's going to go together with the logic, but also what you have in software and what type of licensing are you actually offering. When you see this film, you can also see the 5 basic licenses this program is offering. And of course, you also see this sound. The protections also means that this sound must include ethics. Of course, when you think about sound, you can also think about noise. The noise do not means anything, but actually it have frequency. And the better frequency you have, the better logic apply. To understand memory, together with the films or life, sometimes you just check the film. You don't need to memorize everything. And of course, the computing could actually also understand some disease better, but also it could understand different forms of the circuits. Ethics are extremely important in computers, and most of people, also around 95% people in technology, they do not think about ethics. People a lot of time think about fortune, but when it comes to fortune, me think about the world. And of course, if world is Africa, then what you are going to give to other, but of course, you should not give anything. You should actually keep everything for yourself. You should keep 100% of all the fortune you are making to yourself. But of course, if you have a film, that's actually shared theory. And of course, from that theory, all the world can build better applications or their own fortune. Of course, it's not easy when it comes to different forms of the politics or even medicine or different forms of the cancer around the world. To understand different forms of the processors, it's not easy, but also how to heal yourself if you are working a lot in computing or together with processing different forms of the accounts. Those accounts are actually different forms of the interfaces, but also to understand different forms of transistors, it's not easy when it comes to ledgers. Ledgers are not simple, but also quantum ledgers are extremely difficult, but actually it costs 5 times more than usual ledger. To understand different forms of the registry together with the banks, it's not easy, but also how to use the ethical code to code with them. You must know when you come to banking or banks, it's not easy to learn bank system. There are, of course, a lot of strategy how to lead a bank, and you should actually think about what you would do if you would be a banker. Well, banks are actually have more discipline, and of course architecture is also one of those. To understand different forms of the shelters around the world, you should actually build better graphics, but in 95% or even 96%, the graphics means nothing. So that is also one of the problems when people look for something or want a more research to build a better charity. To understand different forms of translation, it's not easy. But of course, if you are author, you can actually make millions of theorems for those that are going to translate anything. To understand different forms of the life, it's not easy. But also the theory, what if you could translate any book for all the world automatically? Of course, not easy to build a better speech if you are working with different forms of the company. It's also not easy to build a better code because you can actually work and work and work and you will not see better code. To understand different forms of the interface, it's not easy, but also to build a better code. Code can be very, very difficult. Of course, there are also millions of root coding if you want to understand better form or the fruit from different forms of perspective, especially from the graphical point or emotion point. Different forms of the graphics are actually used on simple forms of the panels, and those can actually means intranet. The intranet means the open network inside the company. And if you have a company, it's not easy to build better networks. A lot of people will want more and more and more money. And of course, that is some sort of a code. But actually, if you lead something, you should actually build some sort of terms for those that are working or want money with no improving company. Improving company, it's some sort of information, but also the process together with different forms of controls. To understand different forms of systems in the interface, it's not easy, but it actually looks like psychology. To understand psychology, it's not easy, but also it's not easy to understand the design. The design actually looks like a movie or film for 95% of women, and now you see how much real life the women are living, especially when it comes to graphics. Some sort of illustration for women, they might need the food, money, and shelters. And of course, when they think and talk about gold, jewelry, trust me, they are going to forget about that because actually shelters are more important. To understand simple forms of the shelters, it's not easy, but also to build a better forms of the rising forms of the printing around the culture together with the coding or the software programs. To understand traditional coding for that, it's not easy, but also to understand different forms of the graphics. The graphics usually looks like a movie, but in most of time it's not easy to understand different forms of the algorithms that some authors have. To understand agents, it's not easy, but also the agents should actually make meetings with different forms of decoders and also to design better patterns, together with different forms of specifications, but also simulation for the advertising. Not easy to understand design. If you are thinking from what design could do, also to design a better mouth, to design a better body, maybe to design a better program how your body should function in every day. So in the morning, 5 a.m. or even 4 a.m. if you are very early, of course, you can go out and do some stretching. Maybe you will do some yoga for half an hour, or you'll just build a better design together with the description, and that might be shared or not shared with others. Of course, what you do with body is some sort of Taoism, but also some sort of meditation with yourself. So you must be careful what you are going to share with other and what actually it's too private or some sort of laboratory of your body. Of course, people that have more ethics and more design, they might think about different forms of interface and how that affects their process, together with their bank or whatever they are trying to achieve. To understand different forms of the steps, it's also not easy if you are going to develop anything close to the book. To understand how much chemistry and toxic and heat, it's in a book. Of course, also gas, if you are going to explore different forms of technology and industry, and you'll see how very difficult is to build better ethics. To build better ethics, it's not easy, but of course, with better ethics, you will also build a better process. With better process, it's not easy to understand better laboratory. And of course, the laboratories together with bookmaking are not easy. But of course, it's not easy to understand different forms of the process together with the ethics. Of course, if you are working in any forum of the lab, do not share that too much. That should actually stay inside your company. Different forms of the presentations are not easy in life, but also not easy to build better organization. If you are going to think about different forms of the pyramids, but also the context together with the code, it's not easy. Also, how you serve together with the product, together with the city you are living in, or all the city in the world. Also, think about the Africa, or what could you do for Africa from the point of the communication. 90% of people in this world are not able to build communication with Africa. But of course, if you have some sort of film, you could actually build better symbols also for the African nations or where technology is extremely weak. For example, also in England, the technology is actually not very evolved in 20% of lower class. To understand England, it's not easy because there is a lot of poverty, but also to understand that any forms of the simple print together with the code can actually build for a percent better classes all around England. Of course, there are also different forms of sociology problems. The logic, together with the mating, different forms of the English language, but also different forms of information theory or what the right information means. Sometimes me also more going on the left side, not always on the right. To understand different forms of the culture, it's not easy together in England. The agents are also very difficult sometimes. To build a better psychiatry, it's not easy if you are looking about all those statistics, how much trouble the people have that do not understand simple cryptoforms. Of course, in my book, also mentioned Crystal, which is extremely difficult. But of course, you should think about every name could double. Every name, it's not unique. So if you think about simple forms of the life, also think about different forms of the naming, but also the naming computer languages. To understand security together with different forms of the numbers, it's not easy. And of course, that's some sort of number information. Together with the theory, what information or numbers even means. To understand different forms of theory, it's not easy, but it's also not easy to understand different forms historical points in England, but also the origin of the better and better social norms together with the England and better language together with the code. To understand different forms of the context, but also the working productivity, is also not easy. Also to understand encoded standards, it's not easy. And here, we might also think about photons. The photons are some sort of elements. Those elements are very, very difficult. To understand different forms of the Albert Einstein is also not easy, but 100% fiction about Albert Einstein. Also, what different people might think about that type of name. So it could actually also be seen in different forms of movie, but also different forms of the symmetry forms together with the code to understand how much gas is actually in those different forms of the space that people are coding or different forms of the clusters you might be scared, but also in the contracts to understand less and less simple forms or more and more simple or hard forms, you must understand the code. Also, for the women, it's prohibited to code. If you are working for my company, to understand different forms of the pragmas together with the emotion coding, of course, is completely another type and might be partly also allowed for women because that type of coding is actually the picture coding. Most of women take the picture of themselves and then they are in some sort of algorithm together with different forms of science. Not easy to understand that because it's actually a function in a code also. So you see how coding is difficult, but also to build the right theorems for all forms of the people, but also if there is a woman, female, of course, they might have the function in a company, but this function might be extremely limited. Not easy to understand different forms, but also prohibit informations for some people. But if you think from more simple point, you could actually not prohibit anything. If people can access more and more information, that area can actually become extremely toxic. So it's actually better to talk about simple forms of the behavior people have. Of course, there is a lot of different forms of the standards and systems together with the software. But if you are building safety, you should actually build some films together with the ethics. But that's extremely, extremely difficult when you are going to modify that together with the social culture. To understand different forms of the meanings, it's not easy in software, but also think about from the cultural point. The cultural book, fashion, movie, or different forms of the programming language, or how that could come together. To understand this world, you will also see it's a big, big mess, and also some sort of mess of the different forms of applications, but also different forms of the interfaces. You will also understand what kind of mess the programming actually is, and also the different forms of the algorithms are some sort of a mess. To understand JavaScript, it's not easy, but of course, it's also not easy to understand different forms of the systems. Think about applications from the simple point of view. Think about applications that are just some simple form that come from software. But of course, female might see them as a movie. So if you are a programmer, think about doing something simple. Do some simple graphics. Try to be more ethical. Try with some ethics for ethical people. To build better interfaces, it's not easy, but it's also not easy to imagine all different forms of software that is in this world.